So first off, I'm pretty sure I'm at the right conference because this is the Center for Tall Building in the Horizontal Environment, right? Not the tall building? Because we're going horizontal today. Anybody wishing to see tall buildings, this is the wrong talk. I think the issue and why Kate really had proposed this is this issue of density is so important for cities, and this is so important for the purposes of this conference, but what generates some of the power behind the economics to actually build these very tall buildings? What generates the possibility of developing so much density in our urban spaces? And if we forget about that aspect of our city, well, we're just really building icons that nobody goes into. So I think this is just such a critical thing for us, you know, in general, as we think about the built environment more holistically. The High Line is about a mile and a half long. It's on the west side of Manhattan, and this has really been, I think, a transformational event in New York City in terms of really upgrading, in many ways, the fabric of New York City, but putting some of the demons of the past behind us in city planning, and particularly in historic preservation. But in comparison, of course, the World Trade Center Tower 1 here is notable in terms of going high versus going horizontally. So just for some background for people who might not know some issues of the High Line itself. It's on the west side of Manhattan, about a mile and a half long, starting at about 14th Street, coming up through what was an industrial neighborhood and has been rapidly transformed all the way up into Hudson Yards, which is now being redeveloped as one of the largest mixed-use developments in New York City, if not the largest. Just some history, the High Line, in and of itself, though, for those of you not from New York, the west side really was the industrial heart of Manhattan. Much of the shipping had its piers and things along the west side of Manhattan, and there were freight trains along here. It's called West Side Cowboys because the freight trains at the grade were very dangerous. 10th Avenue was nicknamed Death Avenue, and because you had this mixture of people living and also this industrial rail, and they had cowboys literally lead the trains for safety. This changed in about the 30s, where an elevated line was actually constructed to actually raise the trains above the street grade. So we had, again, you had this mix of sort of industrial activity and residential activity, which is, you know, pretty unique. Interesting enough, the High Line was built in the middle of the block, not over one of the avenues, which is also unique in terms of the positioning of the High Line today. So you see this sort of in the mid-block condition between the two avenues. The High Line was built for these industrial purposes. And this is 1953. In 1994, the High Line was abandoned. Much, if not all of the shipping, had left the west side by that time, moved to the port of New Jersey, and really there was no industrial activity per se to use these freight lines on. So, you know, when I was going to school and growing up in Manhattan, this was the sort of artifact from the past that you didn't really even know what it was, but it was up there, and it was kind of cool. So from rail to trail, this idea of the High Line is amazing how it was really not that long ago. Two residents of Chelsea, Josh David and Robert Hammond, just simply changed the face of the city. They weren't planners, they weren't architects, they weren't even in real estate. They just thought it was a really good idea, and they got to it. And these two gentlemen are really fantastic. They're so dedicated, and I really think they made this mission happen. And they saw the value and the beauty in saving a piece of infrastructure rather than just demolishing it. And this was not a long time ago. This is 1998, 1999, where the city was very close to taking down the High Line. There are some inspirations, of course. This is not the first time somebody's reused a rail line for this type of purpose. The Promenade Plantée in Paris is one of the key inspiring areas, finished in the mid-90s. Again, a reuse of an old viaduct in Paris. But really, this started with Josh and David Josh and Robert, with just advocacy, just, you know, a huge amount of public ingrained advocacy in saving the High Line first. Meeting after meeting, talk after talk, getting the residents actually focused on this. But that wasn't enough. Really, all of a sudden the High Line started to pop in people's imaginations when a photographer was enlisted for his help, Joel Sternfeld, and these images started resonating with people. Resonating with people who had probably for years walked under the High Line, didn't even know what was above there. And to think that actually this is not the park, this is what was there. All of a sudden nature is starting to take over this piece of New York, and yet every day we're walking under it, getting our bagel, hailing a taxi cab, and we didn't even understand what was up there. It was pretty amazing. And they captured this in such a beautiful, poetic way to communicate it to the city. And there was more, so they just started layering these things on. Ideas competitions flowed from there. What could be reused as the High Line? One of my favorites on the right-hand side is a 1.5 mile long swimming pool. Didn't exactly get realized, but you know, these ideas competitions are really important to really just spark the imagination. It got serious when a design competition was engaged, 4 firms engaged in this, and the winning firm was Field Operations with James Corner in the lead of that, and Diller Scafidio Renfode and Liz Diller. And they teamed up landscape and architecture to come up with the winning design. Our firm was involved in it, as well as the lighting designers, L'Observatoire and Piet Udolph. And it was a really just a simple idea. And one of the keys to the idea that Jim and Liz had for this is treat this as a piece of the fabric of New York rather than trying to reinvent it. It didn't need reinvention necessarily. It was already there. And you might think today that that's a really broad and wild idea, but in late 1990s, many of the opportunities here were still to rip this thing down and build something new in its place. And we were still suffering the hangovers for Penn Station and other types of, shall we say, slight disasters in terms of urban planning and historic preservation that the city's seen. But it also didn't end with that. It was just a design competition. Where's the money going to come from? Well, at first, really the money came from this sort of public advocacy, but it also really, you know, the star power in New York. This record 20 million gift from the Diane von Furstenberg Foundation was just really unprecedented in New York City. So sort of trying to the earliest stages of forming a public-private partnership of these ideas. But it wasn't simply that. The city also really got behind the idea. City planning got behind the idea. In fact, virtually every agency in New York got behind the idea, which was fantastic in terms of its support, also made some of the completion of the High Line relatively complex throughout its history. Federal rail banking also was very important to this in terms of CSX, who were the rail operators, wanted to actually get rid of this rail territory. It was unutilized. They wanted to use that rail banking somewhere else. So that also facilitated the transaction. The first section was opened in June 2009, subsequent sections in 2011, 2014. I probably have never been on a project where everybody loved the project so damn much. You can't really find that many people who don't like the High Line. It's really a remarkable thing in terms of combining community, city, private development, and the rest. So the progress plan here was 2009, section 1 on the bottom of the diagram, up to section 2 and section 3. Section 3 is the last of the High Line. The rest of it had been dismantled up to that point. You can see in section 3 up into the top where it circles around Hudson Yard is really where it's left the most raw. If you do walk the High Line, we have a walking tour on Wednesday of it, and you'll sort of see what it was like when it was left abandoned for some 20 years. And, you know, in thinking about this, you know, thinking about the strategies for the High Line, thinking about where the success really came from, I think this is what's very important for us, not just as New Yorkers, but to think about the replicability of this idea. First and foremost, it's attracted a huge amount of attention. This actually is shocking to me that the High Line is now the second most visited public attraction in New York City. In fact, we have, it looks like we may well even be close to exceeding the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Nearly 6 million visitors visited this year alone for something that is free, but for something that was an abandoned viaduct and really doesn't have any specific retail or other types of destination advantages to it. To think that you could create something like that is really, I think, amazing. And really where the success lies, of course, in all of this, is it wasn't just a community idea. It wasn't just a great, new attraction for New York. There is an economic model here that is just incredibly strong and powerful for New York City. The park in and of itself is a good idea, but what it attracted, what it did for a really unutilized portion of Manhattan is just so significant. And that economic story is really where the power is. Numerous new projects. They're really, there's, to think of these as just new projects, but all the renovation that happened, this again was a relatively unutilized industrial area of Manhattan. We had some galleries and other types of artists in, but you didn't have that sort of industrial, the residential base. New jobs created off of the back of that. $2 billion in private investment, $100 million in tax revenue in 2010. These are staggering numbers. The whole of the High Line, which I'll show later, only cost about $140 million for the first 2 phases. So the amount of economic generation that this has the impact that this has had on New York is just astounding. Under development, there's numerous residential projects under development. It's interesting, lots of Pritzker Prize winners floating around there, popping up residential. Maybe not super high, but really quality buildings, really seeding this interesting landscape. And also the High Line has cemented this idea, the West Side, as a design destination. The Whitney Museum, moving to the bottom of the High Line, helped a little bit as well. If you go down there, it's a fantastic new museum. But really this idea of design and design focus has really been just this sort of crucible, and the High Line really tapped into that at the right time. So some of these ingredients for the success, just looking back through, first of all, the location was really an underutilized area of Manhattan, which is great real estate value to begin with. But of course, many cities and even places in Manhattan still exist that are relatively unutilized. These are just images before and after 1985 to 2013. Some of the streets of the meatpacking district. This is where the old Homestead Steakhouse is right here. That building in the back, you might notice, was an old Port Authority building, which is now Google's headquarters. That one deal alone is probably not included in that $2 billion. And they have probably 3,000 to 4,000 employees just in that building. And the street life obviously changed from produce to, shall we say, slightly higher level retail. But the character and the nature of the neighborhood really have actually maintained some of that sort of grittiness. The rezoning proposal from Manhattan City Planning at the time was really instrumental as well. It moved some of the zoning to the streets. Of course, again, the High Line was a mid-block development, so to protect that air and air rights over the views and view quarters over the High Line, some of that zoning was transferred, and that actually also facilitated some of the developments along the avenues. The public-private partnership, which I mentioned before, between Josh and David, Friends of the High Line, which is an extremely well-run organization. We work with them today on the maintenance operations and other types of things going on the High Line, but they really facilitated that partnership with the city, and that was an incredibly important partnership. And as you see, the city, while taking on the brunt of the funding, about $112 million for the city funding, 21 for federal, 11 for private, Friends of the High Line established a nonprofit organization to operate and maintain the High Line, which is again one of the things learned from the Central Park and other types of areas of Manhattan, to really make sure that these parks are operated and maintained very well throughout, and that they have the proper budgets to do this. I think the design has a real impact as well. You go on the High Line and there are details there that I think the design team, Dylan Scofidio and field operations, very proud of. The furniture, the integration of the furniture. I mean, it's a grittiness to it, which, as a New Yorker, I think is really important, but also there's a sort of element of care. We often see many of our public spaces that I grew up in were not as cared for in New York City. And I think this set a different tone. It's not the only example in Manhattan, certainly not the only example in many places, but I think it really was important for the success. And the planting Piet Udolph and Jim's Corner's office, field operations, really had a fantastic vision for this. And the reality is there's not much soil on the High Line. We stripped off all of the concrete, and we really didn't have a lot of planting depth. So we had to do this all in about between 300 and 450 millimeters for the most part of the High Line. So really aggressive planting strategies, interesting all-weather planting as well, was sort of mixed into the whole scape. You can see the surface was a custom designed surface pattern, but we maintained and saved a number of the rail lines. These were taken out and then put back in so that we could create the undercroft for the park. Replicability, finally, just thinking about where this is going. There are so many places that I travel to. I hear about, oh, we have a version of the High Line here, which is fantastic. Many of these were probably started before the High Line came into existence. And I think that idea of urban regeneration and the way that the High Line was achieved is really important. It's really important for the health of cities. Just some examples from the US, Chicago 606, I think was called the Bloomingdale Trail, which opened, a significant portion opened in June of this year. Atlanta's Beltline, conceived of in about 1999, 2000 by a graduate student at Georgia Tech, is now opened up 4 or 5 of its 22 miles in terms of bringing the city, utilizing old right-of-way and rail tracks. And finally, from Rotterdam internationally, this is the Hofbogen. This is again an not utilized elevated rail. I think what's interesting here is the use of the undercroft spaces and arches and other types of things. You might note in a place like New York City, there's millions and millions of square feet of underutilized space under our infrastructure, simply not utilized very well. And I think this speaks really to the heart of this idea about the High Line. It's not about reinventing something, it's about making a city more efficient in a way. It's about reusing actually what we have. And I think these projects and the success of them are becoming more and more real. So creating this quality of space is just absolutely critical. Density is really our only cure in many respects for success in cities. Density. Because driving density drives efficiencies, drives all kinds of solutions to climate change and things of that nature. And it's happening whether we like it or not, because people are moving to cities. How do we make cities better? How do we make them more efficient? How do we create public-private partnerships? How do we create the buy-in from local residents? How do we create those economic models? And finally, I would say, how do we ensure that design matters? I think design's a big part of the High Line. If it was not executed well, I don't think it would be as successful as today. To think that an abandoned viaduct could actually be attracting 6 million people a year to New York City is really an unbelievable success. So I thank everybody involved in this job, Josh and Robert, particularly for their vision. I'm proud to be a New Yorker here talking about it.